Evening falls, candles flicker, and the air is filled with the aromas of favorite dishes. Dylan, with a mix of excitement and nostalgia, prepares a dinner for his wife, celebrating 30 years of marriage. He's crafted the perfect setting, hoping to reminisce over cherished memories together. But just as everything seems to be in place, Dylan overhears a shocking conversation from down the hall. What he hears shatters his heart, forcing him to question everything they've built. How will this night end, and will it mark the beginning of a new path for one of them? And while you're listening to this story, my friend, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Dylan quietly hummed to himself as he tied the last golden ribbon to the chandelier. He paused, admiring the transformed room, a warm pride swelling within him for his work. Soft, golden candlelight filled the living room with a cozy glow, illuminating every decoration he had lovingly placed for their anniversary. From the kitchen, the appetizing aromas of Avery's favorite dishes drifted: creamy pasta, garlic bread, and a rich chocolate fondue prepared for dessert. Whispering to himself, "The final touch," he leaned down and lit the last candle on the centerpiece. Stepping back, he admired his creation, his heart fluttering with anticipation of Avery's reaction. 30 years together, a quarter-century filled with memories, children, and shared dreams. This evening was meant to celebrate, a reminder of the love they had built over the years. Suddenly he was distracted by his wife's muffled voice coming from the guest room at the end of the hallway. It was Avery, speaking softly, almost conspiratorially, her words barely audible through the walls. Curiosity got the best of him, and Dylan moved closer, assuming she too was preparing a surprise for him. As he neared, he heard Avery's voice. Dylan froze when he caught her next words. "The paternity test results are in." Her tone was disturbingly calm, as if discussing something routine. "Not one of the four is his child." Dylan's throat went dry, and he clutched the wall, struggling to keep his balance, his mind frantically searching for some logical explanation, any justification for what he'd just heard. Avery continued, her voice chillingly casual. "Once he pays off the mortgage and covers the kid's tuition, I'll tell him," she laughed lightly. "I'll take the house, we'll split the assets, and then we'll both be free." Her words were like knives, each one sinking deeper than he'd thought possible. The weight of realization felt unbearable, each sentence hitting like a blow. He wanted to burst in and demand an explanation, but his body stayed frozen, paralyzed by the betrayal. 3 decades of love, trust, and dreams crumbled in an instant, like a house built on sand that had just collapsed beneath him. He forced himself to take a breath, though the room seemed to spin around him. Avery's voice faded, leaving only the roaring sound of blood in his ears. He mindlessly glanced around the living room. Balloons, candles, her favorite food, all those thoughtful details he had prepared with such care. It felt like he was at the center of a cruel joke, cast in a role he'd never known he was playing. He knew he had to act now as if nothing had happened. Returning to the living room, Dylan sank onto the couch, her words echoing in his mind, intensifying the pain with each repetition. He steadied his breathing, trying to quell the storm of emotions raging within him. Minutes later, he heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Avery entered, her eyes widening with delight as she took in the decorated room. "Dylan!" she exclaimed, covering her mouth in surprise, a smile lighting up her face. "You really outdid yourself." He forced a smile, striving to keep his voice steady. "Only the best for our 30 years together," he replied calmly, summoning every ounce of composure he had. "Do you like it?" "It's beautiful," she whispered, moving closer and gently kissing his cheek. The gesture felt empty, cold, but he hugged her tightly, wanting to feel every ounce of the betrayal, to make it real. They moved to the table in silence, and Dylan hardly tasted the food. Periodically, Avery glanced at him, her brow slightly furrowed. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. "You seem a bit distant." "Just thinking about everything," he replied, raising his glass toward her. To us, Avery. To 30 years, she echoed, clinking her glass with his, her eyes warm, unaware of the storm he was holding back behind his mask of calm. After dinner, they cleared the table together, Avery chatting excitedly about their upcoming plans. And Matteo's graduation, it's so soon, she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement, her voice filled with enthusiasm. For Matteo, this day was truly significant. Dylan forced a faint smile, though every mention of his son cut him to the core. Yes, he answered quietly, folding a napkin in his hands. I'm incredibly proud of him. When the last course was cleared away, he settled onto the couch, his gaze drawn to Avery, who was animatedly discussing plans for Matteo's graduation. Her enthusiasm only intensified the storm he held deep within. We need to make it something truly unforgettable for him, she suggested, tilting her head thoughtfully. Dylan nodded slowly. Something he'll never forget, he murmured, though his thoughts strayed far from her intentions, already fixed on a different final farewell event. Avery's eyes sparkled, oblivious to the hidden meaning in his words. That's so thoughtful of you, Dylan. You've always been so attentive. He forced a smile and took her hand, studying her face as if searching for traces of the woman he once considered his partner, the mother of children he once believed were his own. But Avery met his gaze calmly, her eyes showing no hint of the secrets that weighed on his soul. She led them into the living room, poured 2 glasses of wine, and settled beside him, resting her head on his shoulder with a contented sigh. Look at what we've built together, Dylan. It truly is something special, isn't it? Irony sliced through him, a silent wound. He gripped his glass, feeling her head as a heavy anchor. Yes, he managed to say, forcing out the word with effort. She smiled softly, seemingly untouched by the storm within him. I'm lucky to have you, Dylan, she whispered, intertwining her fingers with his. Not every woman has a love like this, you know? He looked down at their clasped hands, his throat tight with her unspoken secret, lingering between them. You're right, he whispered, suppressing the bitterness rising in him. Not every woman. The room sank into silence, disturbed only by the flickering candlelight. To an outsider, they could have appeared like any couple, peacefully marking a shared milestone. But Dylan's thoughts had already drifted far, toward plans for escape, knowing this would be the last night he sat beside her. The weight of his knowledge had become unbearable, and his decision had crystallized with sharp clarity. As the evening drew to a close, Avery yawned, stretched, and rose to her feet. I'll take care of the rest tomorrow. Tonight was just perfect, Dylan. He nodded, watching her closely. Please, he whispered, almost inaudibly. She leaned down to kiss him goodnight, but he turned slightly, letting her lips brush his cheek. A flicker of confusion crossed her face, but he feigned exhaustion, shrugging faintly. She didn't press, simply nodded and headed upstairs. Once her footsteps faded, Dylan remained, staring at the remnants of the evening he had so carefully planned. The scene felt foreign, as though he'd hosted a celebration for someone else. He drained his glass, the bitterness matching the resentment building within him. Standing up, he cast one last glance around the room. The candles had nearly burned down, casting faint shadows that stretched across the walls like an empty stage after the final act. Silence filled the space, thickening in the emptiness left by departing players. Taking a steadying breath, he reached for his phone on the kitchen counter. Once, he had thought of hiring a private investigator, gathering evidence and fighting for his share in court. But now, knowing all he knew, he wanted nothing from her. No battle, no trial, not a single thread binding him to this web of deceit. The only thing he craved was freedom. By dawn, the house was silent and empty, the candles long extinguished, leaving only small pools of hardened wax as reminders of what once was. Dylan took his final step over the threshold, leaving behind a life that now felt both familiar and distant. Looking back at the house, he felt a surge of conflicting emotions, a strange mix of closure and anticipation. This was the end of one chapter of his life, but a new one already awaited him beyond this moment. That night, sleep didn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, images of his children surfaced, vivid and unrelenting. He saw their laughter, their boundless energy, and the pure innocence on their faces. He loved them with all his heart, and though he wasn't their biological father, he now understood that it changed nothing. His love for them was unwaveringly real. But his relationship with Avery had reached its end. The next morning, he went about his usual routines, as if it were just any other day. He made breakfast, laughed with Matteo about his recent soccer game, and asked Harper about school. She beamed, her cheeks sticky with syrup. "Dad, can we go to the zoo this weekend?" she asked, waving her hands in excitement. He forced a smile and replied gently, "Maybe, sweetie. I'll see if I can make it happen." Later, as he cleared the table, Matteo came over and quietly expressed his gratitude. "Thank you for paying for my schooling, Dad," Matteo said softly. "I know it's a big amount, but it means everything to me." Dylan felt a lump in his throat, wanting to tell Matteo that nothing, not even a DNA test, would change what he meant to him. Instead, he simply nodded and placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Just keep making us proud, son. I'll handle everything else." In the weeks that followed, Dylan began preparing. Late at night, he meticulously moved funds, ensuring Avery wouldn't notice. He suspected she was watching him, waiting for the right moment to make her own move. She likely thought he was unaware, but now he saw everything clearly. He created a trust fund for each child, building a solid foundation for their future. He even wrote them letters, explaining his reasons, hoping that one day they would understand that he did it out of love. One evening, as he was engrossed in his plans, Avery unexpectedly appeared at the door. "Hi," she said, casually leaning against the door frame. "You're working late. Everything okay?" "Yes," he replied, keeping his tone steady. "Just finishing up a few things before the quarter ends." She shrugged, giving him a slight smile that almost seemed genuine. "All right. Just don't overwork yourself. You know the kids miss you when you're holed up here all night." A bitter laugh almost escaped him, but he held it back. He simply nodded. "I know. It'll all be over soon." Finally, on a quiet Sunday evening, he knew it was time to go. When the house was silent and everyone was asleep, Dylan sat alone at the kitchen table, a blank sheet of paper before him. After a long, thoughtful moment, he picked up a pen and began to write. "Avery, I'm not the man you thought I was, but you aren't the woman I once believed in. This home, this love, this family, it's all woven from lies. I hope you find what you're looking for, but not at my expense. Goodbye, Avery." He folded the letter and placed it beside the paternity test results on the table. Standing there, he looked at the note, fully realizing the finality of what he was leaving behind. It felt surreal, as if he were stepping out of one life and into another, leaving a part of himself behind. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Moving silently through the dark house, he stopped by each of his children's rooms. In Harper's room, he knelt by her bed, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. She murmured something softly in her sleep, turning and instinctively reaching out with her small hand to hold him. "Goodbye, my sweet girl," he whispered, gently kissing her on the forehead. "Be strong, okay?" With quiet determination, he walked into Matteo's room, pausing to admire his son's peaceful sleep. Matteo had always looked up to him, and Dylan still remembered the way the boy had once asked in awe if he could grow up to be just like his father. A sharp pain pierced Dylan's heart as he imagined the confusion Matteo would feel when he realized why his father had left. In every room he passed through, it felt like a part of his soul was left behind, as if he were bidding farewell to the life he had once loved so deeply. By the time he had walked through the entire house, A hollow emptiness settled within him, as though pieces of his soul lingered in every corner of this home. Standing by the front door, he cast one final look at the house he had built, the memories it held, and the family he had once thought would be his forever. Taking a deep breath, he tightened his grip on the doorknob and slipped quietly outside, closing the door with a soft click behind him. The night air burned with icy freshness, grounding him in the reality of his decision. 2 years had passed since that night. 2 years since he had left behind everything he knew, leaving behind wounds, betrayals, and a house filled with bitter memories. In that time, he had built a secluded, simple life in a small mountain cabin. He took on odd jobs in nearby towns, lived in relative isolation, and sometimes looked out at the mountain peaks, wondering how his children were living without him. The ache for his children was a constant pain, dull, yet unrelenting. He had learned to live with it, just as he had learned to live with the betrayal he had left behind. One day, as he was chopping wood by the cabin, the sound of an approaching car broke the silence. His heart quickened. Visitors were a rare sight in such a remote place. He froze, watching as an old car slowly crept up the gravel road and came to a stop. The driver's door opened, and Matteo stepped out. The axe slipped from Dylan's hand and fell softly onto the ground. Matteo looked thin, with dark shadows under his eyes and a weariness on his face that hadn't been there before. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence heavy and thick. Finally, Matteo cleared his throat and spoke. "Dad, I found you." His voice trembled with a hint of pleading. "Please, just hear me out." Dylan's heart pounded, and he fought the urge to pull his son into an embrace. For 2 years, he had convinced himself that leaving had been the right choice. But standing here, face to face with Matteo, all his reasons seemed fragile. "Matteo," he said quietly, almost inaudibly, "why did you come?" Matteo shifted on his feet, hands buried in his pockets. "I had to see you, Mom. She's not well. She lost the house and everything's falling apart." Dylan nodded slowly, feeling a wave of guilt rise up, almost overwhelming him. He had known that leaving would cause pain, but he had tried to believe he was saving them from something worse. He had hoped they would find a way to heal without him, that they would grow stronger without his secrets. Matteo continued, his voice steadier. "We tried to move on, but Mom, she's not the same anymore. Everything changed after you left, and none of us understood why. She told us bits and pieces, but they never added up to the whole story." Dylan took a deep breath and nodded toward the porch. "Do you want to come in?" he asked gently. Matteo nodded, following him into the modest cabin. Inside it was warm, though the decor was simple. A wood stove crackled in the corner, and a single plate dried on the counter. Dylan gestured to the worn sofa, and Matteo sat down, taking in the humble life his father had built for himself. Dylan settled into the chair across from him. "Tell me everything, Matteo," he said softly. Matteo ran a hand through his hair, his gaze falling to his hands. "Mom, she told us after you left that you weren't our real father." His voice wavered. "But that's never mattered to me. You were always my dad, the one who raised us, who taught us everything. And then one day you just vanished. No explanations, no goodbyes. You just disappeared." Dylan's throat tightened, his words barely forming. I thought it would be better for all of you if I left," he finally managed, each word carrying the weight of understanding the consequences of his choice. Matteo's voice trembled, his words filled with pain and barely contained anger. "You thought you were protecting us? That by keeping your distance you were shielding us?" His eyes searched his father's face, pleading. "Dad, you were everything to us. It wasn't about some tests or biology. It was about you. We needed you here, every day." Dylan lowered his gaze, feeling the weight of guilt press down on him like an unbearable burden. Matteo, I really believed I had no other choice. You can't imagine what it's like to hear someone you love make you feel like your whole life didn't matter. Matteo shook his head, disbelief written on his face. I may not fully understand, he admitted, but I know what it's like to lose the only father I've ever known, without warning. I saw Mom break down, and I couldn't do anything about it. His voice softened, becoming vulnerable. Now I'm here, begging you to come back. Please, Dad. A heavy silence settled, thick with unspoken words. Dylan sat motionless, struggling with a surge of emotions he thought he'd buried long ago. He had convinced himself that leaving was the right choice. But hearing Matteo's pain, seeing it so clearly, he began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. Did Mom never tell you why I left? He asked cautiously. Matteo's expression hardened. She said it was complicated. She mentioned something about a paternity test, that you couldn't handle it, but she didn't explain further. Dylan's fists clenched, old wounds reopening. It wasn't just a test, Matteo. I overheard her making plans, planning to take everything after I paid off the house and your education. She didn't love me. I was just convenient. Matteo's face darkened, and he looked away, trying to process the bitter truth. Dad, I don't know what happened between you two, but we still needed you. Harper, she took it the hardest. She barely talks to anyone. Sometimes she even sets a place for you at the table. Dylan felt tears welling up, and one slid down his cheek before he could stop it. I thought leaving was the only way to do right by you all. I wanted to leave something good behind. Matteo's voice trembled, filled with desperate sincerity. Maybe that was your plan, but it wasn't enough, Dad. I know things can't go back to the way they were. I know Mom made choices that can't be undone, but I don't want to lose you too. Dylan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the choices he'd left in the past. He had tried to distance himself from the pain, but now his son was pleading with him to return and fix what had been broken. What do you want from me, Matteo? He asked, bracing himself for the answer. Matteo met his gaze, a spark of hope in his eyes. I want you to come home, to be part of our lives again. You don't have to see Mom if you don't want to, but we need you. Harper, Carter, Camilla, all of us. Dylan looked at his son, feeling the love he had tried so hard to suppress rise to the surface, unbearably clear. He thought of the children, the home he had left, the family he had tried to let go. For years he believed his absence would help them heal, but now he was starting to doubt that decision. After a long pause, Dylan nodded. All right, I'll come back, Matteo. I'll help you understand what happened, and maybe together we can start to heal. His voice was firm, and he held Matteo's gaze. But understand one thing, I can't go back to what was. I don't think I can ever forgive Avery. Matteo nodded, understanding in his eyes. I know, Dad. None of us expect that. We just need you. Dylan gathered his resolve, remembering that he was here as a father, not as Avery's former partner. He took a deep breath, allowing his decision to settle within him. I want to be someone you can rely on, he said gently, addressing Matteo but meaning it for Harper, Carter, and Camilla as well. I can be here for all of you, but it will be a gradual process. It will take time for everyone. A faint, hopeful smile crossed Matteo's face, breaking through the weight of the pain he carried. Thank you, Dad. That's all we really need, Matteo replied, his voice carrying a hint of relief. Dylan's heart beat faster, but for the first time in years, it was filled with meaning rather than bitterness. He nodded, looking at his son. All right, Matteo, he affirmed. We'll be back, but we'll go through this together. In that brief exchange, Dylan sensed the beginning of a new journey, a path built on honesty, a chance at healing, and a fragile hope for rebuilding their family bonds. Matteo's face showed relief as he stepped forward, embracing his father tightly. As Dylan hugged his son, He felt years of bitterness fade away, replaced by a warmth he hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. For the first time in many years, Dylan felt a possibility of peace. Walking toward the house that had once been his home, he noticed the tension in Matteo's posture and decided to remain silent, hoping his presence alone would bring comfort. The house loomed ahead, appearing as worn and empty as he had felt 3 years ago when he left. The garden, once vibrant with tulips he and Avery had planted together, was now overrun with weeds. Inside, the front door creaked as they entered, and the air was thick and stale from neglect. Avery stood in the hallway as if she had been waiting for him. She looked thinner, her clothes faded and wrinkled, her hair disheveled, and dark circles framed her tired eyes. "Dylan," she whispered, her voice fragile, a blend of disbelief and desperation. Her hand trembled as she reached out, as if hoping to somehow bring him back into her life. "You really came back. I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Dylan's gaze remained steady, his expression closed and unreadable. "I didn't come back for you, Avery," he said firmly, his voice devoid of warmth. "I'm here for them." He gestured toward Matteo, who had lingered by the door, and just then, the sound of their younger children's footsteps came from the top of the stairs as they watched. Avery's face fell, her lips trembling as she realized this wasn't a reconciliation. She took an uncertain step closer, her voice shaking with regret. "I know I hurt you, Dylan. I know I made mistakes, and I'm so sorry. I pay for it every day." "Pay?" Dylan repeated, his voice carrying the bitterness that had built up over years. "You don't even know what it means to truly pay, Avery. You lied to me. You lied to our children. You destroyed everything we built together." He paused, his words as sharp as a blade. "And for what?" he continued, his tone full of accusation. "For a lie you thought you could just bury?" Avery's face twisted in pain, and she reached out, as if hoping to touch the past and somehow undo the harm she'd caused. "I was wrong, Dylan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I see that now. I've been punished enough." "Punished?" His voice was low and controlled, each word cutting like glass. "Your punishment is far from over, Avery. It's nowhere near done." "I was left shattered," he continued. "Everything I believed to be real turned out to be an illusion, and I wasn't the only one who suffered." He gestured toward their children who had quietly gathered, drawn by the tense silence filling the room. "They're the ones who suffered most." Avery turned, her gaze settling on each child. Harper, the youngest, clung to the railing, her eyes wide and full of uncertainty. Carter's face, however, was set, reflecting anger and a sense of betrayal. Camila's gaze dropped to the floor. She couldn't look her mother in the eyes. Matteo stood nearby, expressionless, but his stance made one thing clear to Dylan. He was here, but not for Avery. "I love them," Avery said to Dylan, desperation in her voice. "I tried to make things right. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. I just made a bad choice," she continued, her voice faltering. Dylan's reply was sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. "This wasn't an accident, Avery. You made a choice." Her eyes pleaded with him, filled with a desperate appeal. "I never thought it would end this way. I didn't understand what it would cost me. Please, Dylan, isn't there any chance to start over?" When she reached out to him, Dylan took a step back. "It's too late, Avery. The life we built, the family I believed in, it's all over. You destroyed it, and now you have no right to ask for a second chance." Avery sank to her knees, clutching his legs, her face contorted in despair. "Please, Dylan, don't do this. I've already lost everything. I'll do anything to make it right. Just don't leave us again." Dylan's face remained cold. "I'm not leaving them, Avery, but I am leaving you." He stepped back, her hands slipping off, leaving her sitting on the floor, broken. Turning to the children, he met each of their gazes in turn. His voice softened as he spoke. "I know you've been through so much," he said. You've seen things you should never have had to witness, and I'm sorry for that." He paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "But now you have a choice. You can stay here or come with me." His voice carried a sense of determination. "We can start fresh, build something real, based on honesty. But this is your decision to make." Harper looked between her parents, her eyes wide with confusion. She was too young to fully understand, but the pain in her father's eyes was unmistakable. "Dad," she whispered, stepping forward and taking his hand. "I want to go with you." Dylan knelt down to meet her gaze. "Then come with me," he said gently. Squeezing her hand to reassure her, Carter crossed his arms, his eyes fixed on his mother. "You lied to us," he said, struggling to hold back his emotions. "You made us believe Dad left us, that he wasn't around. I'm going with him. I'm tired of all the lies." Camila, shoulders slumped, looked at her mother with a sadness beyond her years. "I can't stay, Mom. You didn't tell us the truth. I want to go with Dad." Matteo stepped closer to his siblings, his face resolute. "We're supposed to be a family, and families are honest with each other, even when it's hard," he said. "But you chose to lie, Mom. I'm going with Dad." Avery looked at each of them, shock and sorrow etched on her face. "You're all just going to leave me? Just like that?" she whispered, barely audible. Carter's expression was calm, but tinged with sadness. "You left us a long time ago, Mom. We're just finally acknowledging it." Dylan watched as disbelief in Avery's eyes turned into painful, resigned understanding of reality. She now realized that he and their children were truly gone from her life. Feeling the weight of responsibility for his children standing beside him, Dylan suddenly felt a surprising calm. This wasn't victory, not in the usual sense. He felt no joy in the destruction of a life that had once been filled with genuine love and meaning for him. Instead, he felt clarity, a liberation that came from accepting the truth and moving toward a future free from illusions. He turned to his children, his voice steady and determined. "Pack your things. We're leaving tonight." As the children went to gather their belongings, Avery stood in the doorway, her empty gaze a haunting reminder of who she once was. For a moment, Dylan looked her way. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Avery," he said, his voice and gaze unwavering. "But not at our expense anymore." With these words, he turned away, leading his children toward a new beginning, a beginning free from the shadows of betrayal and broken trust. It wasn't the life he had once dreamed of, but it offered the chance to build something real and honest, for himself and for his children, who ultimately stayed with him. 3 months later, sitting on the porch of his modest new home, Dylan felt the evening breeze rustling the trees around him. Only a few months had passed since they left their old life behind, but it already felt like a distant memory. For the first time in years, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The road to recovery would be long, but he was no longer haunted by the ghosts of the past. From the kitchen, soft laughter drifted out. His daughters were attempting to cook, their joyful voices mingling with the sounds of pots and pans. Outside, Carter and Matteo were tossing a football back and forth, their easy chatter filling the yard. Dylan had once dreamed of evenings like these, simple, joyful moments with his children, free from secrets and tension. Shortly after they settled into their new place, Dylan met Mia at a community event for new families in town. She was unlike anyone from his past, gentle yet strong. Her quiet resolve immediately drew him in. Mia had her own story, a strength born from her own trials. Conversations with her flowed naturally, like reconnecting with an old friend from another life. One evening, as they were packing up after an event, Mia noticed his pensive expression and smiled softly. "You seem far away, Dylan," she observed. He laughed, running a hand over the back of his neck. "Yeah, I suppose I am. Just thinking about how much has changed." Her warm, understanding gaze met his. "Letting go of what you leave behind is often the hardest part of change," she said, her voice calm. Her words struck a deep chord within him. "I carried that weight for a long time," he admitted, feeling a wave of vulnerability rising. But her reassuring, encouraging look gave him the strength to continue. "These last few months, it feels like I'm finally ready to let some of it go." She gently touched his hand. "You're allowed to start over, Dylan," she said quietly. "We all are." In that simple gesture, something profoundly significant stirred between them, a connection that required no words. In the weeks that followed, their paths crossed often, sometimes by chance at local gatherings, sometimes through quiet invitations. One weekend, Mia invited Dylan and his children to a picnic by the river on the town's outskirts. She arrived with a basket full of sandwiches, fruit, and fresh cookies. Dylan watched with quiet admiration as Mia effortlessly connected with his children. Struck by her natural warmth, Harper and Camilla sat beside her, eagerly soaking up baking tips, while Carter and Matteo shared stories of their small-town adventures with her. At one point, Matteo leaned over to his father with a mischievous grin. "Dad, she's awesome," he whispered, glancing over at Mia. "Maybe you should keep her around." Dylan laughed and tousled Matteo's hair with a smile. Under the shimmering sky, with hues of sunset reflected on the lake's surface, Dylan nodded encouragingly at Mia. They sat together on a blanket, watching the children skip stones across the water. Their laughter rippled softly across the calm surface. Mia looked at him, her gaze gentle but curious. "You know, when you're with them, you're different," she said quietly. "The way you're rebuilding your life, your deep commitment to it, it's truly admirable." Dylan just shrugged, a shy smile forming under her gaze. "I'm just trying to give them the stable life they deserve," he murmured. "They've been through too much for their age." Mia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's exactly what makes you such a remarkable father, Dylan." Her voice was firm, yet tender. "You took the pain and turned it into something beautiful for them. A new chance. They're lucky to have you." Her words resonated deeply in his heart, stirring emotions he'd long buried. He looked at her, touched by her sincerity. "Thank you, Mia. That means a lot to me." In the weeks that followed, Mia became a steady presence in his life and his children's lives. She was patient, never asking for more than he was willing to give. Gradually, their bond grew stronger, and he began to open up to her in ways he never thought he could. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Dylan and Mia sat on the porch, each with a mug of warm tea. The stars glittered above, softly illuminating the quiet town. Mia turned to him, her gaze unwavering. "Dylan," she began softly, "you've come so far since the day we met. I see it in your laughter, in the way you're really present with the kids. You're alive again." Her words were a balm to him, and he took a deep breath, feeling calm. "I used to think trust wasn't for me," he admitted, "that it was something foreign to me." He lowered his gaze, then looked back at her, feeling his resolve strengthen. "But you showed me it's worth giving it another chance. You gave me hope, Mia." She smiled and gently took his hand. "And you gave me hope too, Dylan. I never thought I'd find someone who truly understands me." Her voice softened. "I genuinely care about you and the kids. If you want, I'll stay." He felt warmth rise within him and squeezed her hand, a silent, unspoken acceptance of what he was not yet ready to say in words. They sat together, hands intertwined, as the night wrapped them in its gentle embrace. For the first time in years, Dylan allowed himself to imagine a future without the bitterness that had weighed him down for so long. It wasn't perfect. The scars and memories remained, some still fresh. But he was beginning to understand that healing didn't erase the past. It simply transformed it, allowing him to carry it forward as part of his journey. One evening at a family dinner, Harper looked at him with curiosity. "Dad, does that mean we're staying here forever?" Dylan glanced at Mia, who nodded encouragingly. Smiling, he turned to Harper and the other children, his voice warm and gentle. "Well," he began softly, "we've found a place where we can be happy." His voice was filled with hope. "We have friends here, something like family, and if that's what you all want, then this can be our home forever." The children cheered, their faces lighting up with joy. Carter, usually reserved, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile and nodded. "Then it's settled," he said quietly. "We're staying." As Dylan looked at the bright faces of his children and felt Mia's steady hand in his, he realized he had achieved something he'd once only dreamed of. He had rebuilt his life on a foundation of love and trust, not just for himself, but for his children. It was a life without secrets, filled with genuine hope. In that moment, surrounded by the laughter and warmth of family, Dylan knew he had finally found peace. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Avery sat alone in her dimly lit, cramped apartment. The walls were bare, adorned only with a few faded photos, the remnants of a life that now seemed distant and unrecognizable. She held one of the frames, her fingers trembling as she traced the familiar faces of her children. They were so young, their eyes bright with laughter and innocence. Dylan was in the photo too, his arm around her, looking at her with a love she hadn't felt in years. That gaze, once so familiar, now haunted her. Leaning back, she closed her eyes, feeling the weight of regret press down on her. She had once been the woman he loved. She had everything: a devoted husband, a beautiful home, and children who adored her. But now that life felt like a distant memory, slipping further and further out of reach, those memories now seemed like faint shadows slipping through her fingers, leaving her grasping at scattered pieces of the past. She had risked everything, placing her hopes in a future that never came to be. A sarcastic smile touched her lips as she thought of her former lover, the one who had promised her a life of excitement, whispering dreams of grandeur and freedom, dreams that were so far from the quiet life she had known with Dylan. But when Dylan disappeared, so did her lover The illusion didn't last long. Once he realized that the stability and wealth she had hinted at were unattainable, his patience began to wane. Eventually, he too left her, abandoning her to deal with the consequences of her choices alone. One day, while walking along a quiet street, she noticed a family on the opposite side. A father held his young son's hand tenderly, while the mother carried a laughing toddler on her shoulders. The scene stirred something deep within her, awakening a pain she thought she had buried. She instinctively reached out, as if she could touch that lost happiness, but the family disappeared around the corner, leaving her staring at an empty street. A sudden fit of coughing brought her back to reality, a harsh reminder of her deteriorating health, something she could no longer ignore. With no support around her, even simple tasks took too much out of her. There was no one to help. Her children had drifted away, their calls growing fewer until they vanished from her life completely. Silence consumed her, an unrelenting reminder of everything she had given up. She tried to reconnect, leaving voicemails for Matteo, desperately wanting to hear his voice. "Matteo, it's Mom. Please, I just want to hear your voice. I know I've made mistakes, but can we talk? I miss you. I love you." She whispered into the phone, but there was no reply. In a last attempt, she wrote a letter to Dylan, asking for forgiveness, but her words went unanswered. One evening, overwhelmed by regret, she broke down, her sobs filling the empty apartment. Clutching her phone, she scrolled through old family photos, birthdays, vacations, candid moments she had captured without a second thought. Each photo was a bittersweet reminder of the life she had destroyed. Every familiar face, Dylan, the children, even her own, felt like that of a stranger. When the phone rang, a spark of hope flickered within her, thinking it might be one of her children. But it was only a reminder about an overdue bill, a penalty for medical expenses she could barely afford. Over the past year, her health had worsened drastically, and the absence of family weighed on her more heavily than ever. One morning she went to a nearby park, hoping the fresh air might clear her mind. She watched families picnicking, children laughing, and parents savoring simple, joyful moments. An elderly woman sat beside her on the bench. They exchanged polite smiles, and after a few quiet minutes, the woman looked at her, as if sensing her sorrow. "Are you all right, dear?" the woman asked gently. Avery forced herself to smile. "Just thinking about how things used to be." The woman nodded, her gaze full of understanding. Memories can be relentless, can't they? But sometimes we have to make peace with them, even if it hurts. Avery lowered her head, feeling ashamed. "It feels like it's too late for me." The woman shook her head. "It's never too late to find peace, even if you can't fix everything. Sometimes peace is simply accepting where you are, even if it's not where you wanted to be." Those words stayed with Avery long after she left the park. That night, lying in bed, she wondered if peace would ever come to her. She knew she couldn't undo her choices. The lies, the betrayals, they had all come back to haunt her, leaving her only with regret. As the months passed, her health continued to decline. Hospital visits became a regular part of her life, each one draining her savings further. The vibrant life she once knew had narrowed down to doctor appointments and endless empty hours. Sometimes, she still tried to reach out to her children, clinging to the faint hope that one day they might come back into her life. She no longer expected a response. She had long stopped sending letters filled with apologies that she knew no one would read, promises she couldn't keep. Writing those letters had become a ritual, a way to cope with the weight of guilt, but it did nothing to loosen the binds of regret that held her fast. Then one day, as she sifted through an old box of keepsakes, she found a crumpled birthday card from Dylan, a relic from a time when they were still together and felt whole. Opening the card, she saw his familiar handwriting, and tears blurred her vision. "To my one and only, my companion, my best friend, I love you more than words can express. May we have many more years together. Forever yours, Dylan." Each word sank deep into her soul, reopening wounds she had thought healed. These lines were a living reminder of the love she had let slip away. She clutched the card to her heart, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she whispered into the silence, "Forgive me, Dylan. Forgive me. Forgive me." Years passed. Dylan, now married to Mia, was surrounded by a large, boisterous family, children and grandchildren. His life had become what he once dreamed of, full of warmth, laughter, and love, a love that had once been broken but was now fully healed. His past remained a part of him, but it no longer held him captive. Occasionally he wondered where life had taken Avery, but his thoughts never lingered there. He had released the pain and found forgiveness in his heart. His family with Mia and the strong bonds they shared were a testament to the resilience he had gained. One evening, sitting in a cozy living room surrounded by family, he felt a wave of gratitude. He had emerged from the darkest corners of his past stronger, with a heart open to a love that was genuine and enduring. He looked at Mia, and she returned his gaze with an understanding that was theirs alone. They had both endured their struggles, but together they had carved out a new path. In that quiet moment, Dylan realized that despite the shadows of the past, he had finally found a life full of joy and contentment, a life built on trust, love, and the beauty of a second chance. Regrets and betrayals had dissolved, leaving only the bright promise of a future he was ready to embrace. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.